Lots going on, and anyone in this audience who said they predicted Trump would be president, you probably had inside information from Russia, so that does not count, okay? I'm going to weave through some trends here, and I will leave time for questions and comments, and if I don't know, unlike most people from Washington, I'll tell you I don't know, okay? But I like to connect dots and things that we're seeing right now, even though it's chaotic. But I'll tell you some bottom lines, and truthfully, on Trump so far. If you don't read his book, The Art of the Deal, you're doing yourself a disservice. He's almost running the operation or trying to, page after page. People have said, told him, you can't run the government by business. Well, as you probably know, you can't tell Trump. And if you think he's going to change, he's not going to change. He's really has Washington topsy-turvy, both political parties. And inherently, they don't want him to succeed, frankly, because then a non-politician, and he's definitely not a politician, will have shown that you can lead the country. So there's vested interest there. But the biggest thing I can tell you that I've learned so far is that his bark is a lot worse than his bite. And you see that in the book, too. And that's going to delve into trade policy that is so important to the business of agriculture and in the meat sector. So politics. We had the shutdown, and most Democrats now say it was a mistake to link illegal immigrants and shutting down the government. So we're going to go through this whole thing again by February the 8th, and I've already seen GOP leaders say they're probably going to need another continuing resolution. But this budget's going to be important for a host of issues that are going to be linked to an eventual need for an omnibus budget agreement, and I'll go through, some of those. The House and Senate majorities are up for grabs in November elections. You're probably sick of elections, especially Iowa, but they're going to be important again because you're going to see the uncivil aspects of Washington continue as long as we have either political party close to becoming in power the next election. And so this election's not going to solve anything because it'll still be very close ratios in both the House and Senate. The state level elections coming up, we have 34 governors coming up for re-election. Very important at state levels and of course for presidential elections and in the redistricting that will be going on based on the just completed census. So watch those. A Democrat civil war is going on here, and you saw it in the shutdown. I think Chuck Schumer, who's the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, he's normally a better political person than that. So why did he do what he did? I think it was the pull of the far left, if not socialist, in his party who were telling him to do what he did. So you've got the Democratic Party, the Bernie Sanders type, then you have the Elizabeth Warren type, and then you have whatever you want to call the term established Democrats or more moderate Democrats. They're all tussling right now. Similar in ways to the opposite end in the Republican Party. I have never seen in my over 40 years in Washington both political parties have an intra-political party wars at the same time. And President Trump, he's not really a Republican. He's a populist, more of a libertarian. I think what we're seeing is the beginning of a third party with Trump. And then the more established, Republicans will come back into fold in the future. I'm not saying that's a negative sign. A country, I was a history major in college, and a country of our duration usually has a minimum of 3 viable, and that's the key word, they're viable political parties. We're going to become increasingly like Europe. Not so much a parliament, but whoever wins presidential elections, I think in the growing future, are going to have to have alliances with different groups. And then we have the rise of the women movement. Will that translate, as it well could, in a significant increase in the number of not only women candidates, but women going to the polls? And if you don't think that has the Republican Party nervous, that's an understatement. So that's another potential mega change that we're seeing. The Republicans right now have a mini ceasefire. And you saw it even with President Trump. I mean, he actually did more by not saying a word at the key elements of the shutdown of the government. He tried to work a deal with his good friend, Chuck Schumer, and then it blew up. And then, of course, you know Trump. He wanted to come right back in. But the Republican leadership in Congress said, let them come back to you. And by just shutting up, the Democrats could not make him the topic of discussion. So that's how it actually ended. But again, that's hard for Trump to be silent, you know. Now, perspectives. Both sides think they're winning, so they're planning on doubling down. So that's why we have, you know, this friction that you see. The Trump media feud will actually intensify. I mean, I've not seen ever any president take on the press, right and wrong aspects of it. Now, I came up through the reporting cycle many years ago, and we were taught, hopefully, to be as fair as you possibly can be, but you're always, the subjects you pick to write about, the headline, it's always got a little tinge, not so much a bias of what issues you select. But I'll tell you, the Eastern media is definitely biased. I mean, there's no other way to put it. CNN is ashamed of 95%, if not more, of their news segments, quotes, news in quotes, is anti-Trump. The New York Times, although still the paper of the world, is clearly biased, and the Washington Post, don't let me even go there, you know. So he has that going against him, but he takes them on. But then you have, and I'm not a believer in the secret society and the intelligence community, but I'll tell you, all those leaks that you saw the first few months of the Trump administration, clearly it was the disgruntled people in the FBI and even the CIA and the State Department, some of whom were Obama holdovers, didn't want him to be president and want him out. And that is seriously going on, and that's not good for any democracy. Many people, I go across this great country, and yeah.
What do you expect to get this fall? Are we going to get 33 separate runs in the states that have Senate seats, or is there any chance they're going to try to amalgamize this into a national election for this Senate?
The off-year elections, the first election of a new president, there's a clear history. Not every time, you know, George W. Bush escaped that one time of his. It's always against the political party in the White House. It's a referendum on the president. No one can convince me otherwise. I mean, it's not, what the Democrats have to offer, you know. So this time they can get by without offering, well, what would you do? That's their problem. With Trump's rating, depending on what poll, if you believe polls, and I don't believe many of them, from 38 to 42%, that usually signals trouble on that one. And I'll have more on individual races.
But in this case, we've got 25 Democratic senators.
You have 26, actually, now with Al Franken's replacement, and only 8 Democrats. So math would tell you, okay, that the Senate, the Republicans could actually gain 1 to 2 seats. But then you have to look, there's only about 8 to 10 really competitive Senate races. So then you have to look more on the Republican side, who are in the open seats, who are going to be the candidates. Republicans have a way of really screwing themselves, to be blunt, in elections, whereby picking primary candidates to the right of Attila the Hun. Okay? And they can win the primary, but they can't win the state election. So we're going to see if Steve Bannon, the dethroned Stephen Bannon, who whispered anti-trade stuff in Trump's ear all the time, whether or not his dethronement is going to lead to more moderate, if that's the right term, Republican candidate. It's an unknown we have to go through, okay? So market volatility is going to increase, not decrease. I mean, the first year of Trump actually feels like 8 years to me. I mean, I can write a column about every 3 hours. There's so much information out there. Why did I say market volatility? Because of the wild cards. I'll do a lot in trade policy, and I know that's one of your, if not the biggest issue right now. What does he do? Is he a protectionist? But I think when you read his book, I'm not one of the majority who thinks that he's going to walk away from NAFTA. It's all sound and fury right now. It's a negotiating tactic. That's why he got mad at the ag groups and NPPC, and I'll give a tip of my cap to your group. They were one of the first, and they continue to be the best in galvanizing education of lawmakers, of the White House, including President Trump, and the American public on the mostly advantages of keeping an open and fair trading system. But I'm getting ahead of myself right now, but it's important to your industry. Trump, the senators, farm state senators met with Trump, several weeks ago. And somebody at the meeting said, is there any Republican senator who wants you to pull out of NAFTA, Mr. President? And there were more than a few senators in that room. And Bob Lighthizer, who's the U.S. Trade Representative, was at that meeting. And they couldn't list one. And Trump said, and this made me quite nervous, Trump said, well, I am surprised at all this support for keeping in NAFTA from what I've heard. Well, who's advising him? You see, it was Steve Bannon. It was Bob Lighthizer, U.S. Trade Rep, who's usually a very smart guy. I remember as a beat reporter covering him when he was assistant to Senator Bob Dole. Well, if you work for Bob Dole, you know agriculture. But he gets very aggressive in trade policy. And Wilbur Mills, the Commerce Secretary, is very borderline protectionist. He made his initial money in taking on the steel shippers to our country. So now that Trump is having a different ear, hopefully that we've reached that nervous peak, and now we're going the other way. Let's hope. I'll have more on the impacts if he were to walk away. So volatility is going to increase. I know the value of the dollar just made new 3-year lows yesterday. And I had a discussion with the gentleman that someone at this conference was asked a question. Why is the dollar so weak? I used to be a market reporter many years ago now, and I would say usually number one, it's always hard to do a currency outlook. Federal Reserve leaders have said that in testimony. That notwithstanding, the reason I think that the dollar is low now is that futures traders have already baked in the interest rate increases that's coming this year and in 2019, and they're looking around the world, especially Europe, where the euro has appreciated definitely relative to the dollar since January 1, and it's because Europe has not even started going the way the U.S. has done relative to increasing interest rates. So they're still quantitatively easing. So once Europe and Japan starts tightening, the futures market will probably already have that factored in to prices because of the run-up now. And another reason is you have a synchronized world economy that's growing right now. Europe is actually growing more than the U.S., and the emerging markets are all growing. The world economy is just shy of 4%. Now, the 4% GDP, gross domestic product, which means economy. The reason that's important to your industry is once you get 4% or more of world GDP, that signals a demand pull markets. Not only the wanting meat products, but the ability to pay for them. So I always tell your sector, watch the world GDP, and especially in countries that you market to. Look at their currency relative to the U.S. dollar. That's how I would have answered that question. Yeah, the dollar is going to base. And right now it's pretty good from an economics perspective. But again, history shows that your currency has to either go up or down 10% or more and stay at that level before it has any sustained impact on trade. So sometimes it's giving too much, credit. People are still government. And the day I forget that is the day I retire. Now, in agriculture, we have some pretty good people in place. You're Secretary of Agriculture. I want to go through a little personalities. Sonny Perdue, former governor of Georgia. Any governor knows a multitude of issues. But he was also a commodity trader, and that's what brought Trump back to him. He was first interviewed in November, and it took until January for them to eventually pick Sonny Perdue, if not December. He was trying to find, to be very blunt with you, a Latino. He would ask every candidate, even though they were not Hispanic, do you have any Hispanic blood in your family? I mean, he actually, and you can hear Trump say that, you sure? But he remembered when Sonny said he was a risk taker, and see, Trump liked that. Now, that's why I think Sonny Perdue is good. He knows in policy, when you make a decision, there's winners and losers. So you give me that type of person any day. My fear on Sonny Perdue in the future is if, and I don't think he will, but if Trump were to walk away from NAFTA, Sonny Perdue would lose some credibility, because that's what any good reporter should do. Is he's obviously not listening to you. So I hope we don't have to see that. So Sonny Perdue, good person, knows markets, knows trade policy, is a trader, T-R-A-D-E-R. Then you have the U.S. Trade Representative, which I said is Robert Lighthizer. He also was a former deputy U.S. trade rep under the Reagan administration. He knows theory of trade policies, etc. He's been accused of being a protectionist. And when I've asked the people there that, they go, no, we're not protectionists, we're protecting the American consumer and the American producer. There's a fine line there. The America First tag, Trump, whenever he visits a country, he goes, you should put your country first. Just like I am with America First. Now that can lead to volatility and a lot of potential trade conflicts that I think we're going to see increasingly in the years ahead. People are important. Scott Pruitt, administrator of EPA, a very friendly relationship with Trump. He is dramatically changing the Environmental Protection Agency, doing buyouts, significantly lowering the number of people at EPA. Not necessarily bad. If you have too many regulators, what do you think a regulator is going to do if their job is to regulate? They're going to regulate. So you put a governor on the number of people. And the biggest thing that Scott Pruitt has bought, and your industry is feeling mostly the positives of this, and with Trump, is bringing cost benefits back to the regulatory decisions. And Trump has said, if this new rule is going to cost more than it benefits, we're not going to do it. Now, I haven't heard that for years in Washington. Usually when you fly over the Potomac to go to our nation's capital, 1 + 1 on a good day is 3. It doesn't have to make sense in Washington. That's where smart people go wrong all the time. When they don't they understand? I said, wait a minute. You're going under the assumption that it has to be logical. That's not Washington, I know it gets you upset, And maybe this election has given enough people in both political parties the signal that change has to come. Remember all the elitists in the East who called Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, Missouri flyover states? That was an insult. And they didn't even know they were insulting people. Now, I have to come to Des Moines to see the first Residence Inn at Marriott that was based on millennials, surveys of millennials. I'm going to have to rethink my ideas of millennials because it works. I mean, this new Residence Inn, I tip my hat. I mean, they had brie cheese for breakfast, you know. So if you listen, I had a German grandmother who had the phrase in German, if you don't listen, you feel. And that's what Washington is feeling right now. They're used to being in control, both political parties. So I love it. I love it. But the vast majority of people who like Trump like what he's doing, not how he's doing it. It's the way he does it that should make you cringe, just cringe. But yet, he's not going to change. Now, more congressional departures. The key to elections is how many open seats are there? And you're seeing increasingly number of seats open up in the Republican Party, and they're currently chairmen or chairwomen of these committees. So they're sensing something. So that's another signal of storm clouds on the horizon. The White House Special Counsel skirmishes, you know, the Russia thing. I'm asked about this, where it's going to go. I said, look, it's drip, 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 you know. I don't know, but it just doesn't look good right now. And Trump's mouth could get him in trouble if it gets into the obstruction of justice. It's not the initial aspect. It's what we saw in the Nixon administration. I'm not predicting anything, but it was the cover-up that got Nixon in trouble, that they just would have, you know, confessed, you know. It's like I'm a Catholic, and I remember going to confession all the time. And Father Deneen was the priest at the time. And I would always say my sins, and I would always say I kicked my brothers and sisters. And one time, this is a true story, it sounds like a Seinfeld episode, he stopped and he said, well, wait a minute. I thought, oh my goodness, he's asking a question. He goes, how many times do you kick your brothers and sisters? And I said, you mean I have to start counting? So I quit doing it. That's called accountability. It's called accountability. And that's what Washington needs. Accountability in anything they do. Again, both political parties. I've seen the best policies when it's thought out. Okay? More on that later relative to tax policy. Policy. If they want to get anything done, they meaning Republicans, the initial headline of my speech is, can Republicans govern? Now, I will answer that because we were taught as journalists early on, when you have a question headline, you better answer it, okay, early on. I would say yes, but it ain't easy, okay? It's not easy in this day and age. And if you have a concerted focus, if Trump focuses on an issue and stays there, okay, he has shown that he can get things done, and hopefully that's going to be the case in infrastructure. So, why do I say early this year? April and May, they don't get things done by then. It's going to be even harder. Why? That's when the primary seasons are happening in elections. So they're going to be very nervous going into elections. So we're going to see a lot done the first 4 or 5 months of this year, hopefully. Global populism will spread, and that's challenging trade policy. So that means the potential for wild cards, black swans, are all over the place, you know, because you have the foments. You have, it's almost not only between the haves and have-nots of the world, the haves and have-nots of governments of the world. So that's, you get that, that's very sensitive areas. And geopolitics risks are going to grow. North Korea. At least Trump is saying, look, both Republican and Democratic presidents in the past, they basically appeased North Dakota. And we've seen in history, if you appease any leader, in quotes, it's not a good sign. But the options with North Korea are not very friendly. So what do you do? I thought Trump scored a big thing when he got China to vote in favor of increased sanctions on North Korea. Of course, they did some end arounds, but just voting in public for those sanctions was a major geopolitical coup for him. But of course, 2 days later, he did something, in tweets to get the issue off of it. Which Trump are we going to get on any given almost hour? It's almost like an angel and then the devil on his shoulder. I mean, that's how he is. You've seen it. You've heard it. I've talked to businessmen, very smart businessmen, who go in one-on-ones with him and they go, well, at least we know he's not crazy, Now, and you saw that the other day in the unbelievable press conference where many in the media were upset that he got a good bill of health, They were upset that you could eat that many McDonald's and drink 10 to 15 Diet Cokes a day and still be relatively healthy. And you heard what the doctor said. Genetics, okay? I just wish some of the media would have the same test myself. Now, so Trump is an emotional president. But if I had one thing to tell him is, you're similar to Bill Clinton in this way. Clinton to me, I used to be White House correspondent. The best president I ever covered, best is a value word I know, was Reagan. He was what you saw, gentleman. Treated his staff unbelievably so, and was smart on the issues that he needed to be smart on. Clinton was the most intelligent president I ever covered. But, and here's the connection with Trump, he could have done a lot more had it not been for, let's just say, foibles. Okay? And Trump, my question to him is, do you realize what you could do for this great country if you would just lower it a notch or two to galvanize the people and the government? So I think he's losing some possibilities of dramatically changing this country in areas that it should be changed. Immigration policy that will go through, and infrastructure. He still may do it, but it'll be like a war getting through that because of the way he does things. He is doing what he pledged to do in the campaign. He's checking them off. Regulations, the judicial system, I'll have a chart here. I think his biggest signature issue whenever he's out of office will be how he's changed the federal court system. He's announcing a lot of lifetime appointments. And the Supreme Court, a lot of people voted for Trump for many different reasons. One is it was anti-Hillary vote. Just wherever I went, I heard that. I don't want to vote for Hillary Clinton. Not everybody. But another one was Supreme Court appointment. Big reason. And he picked Neil Gorsuch, a conservative. Now Trump is saying the worst kept secret in Washington is Anthony Kennedy, a Supreme Court justice, is probably going to retire sometime this summer. At least that's the rumor. And he's more the moderate one. Conservative on some issues, moderate on social issues. Well, if Trump gets to have another pick, it's interesting because you only need 50 votes, and it will be before the November elections. And Trump always adds a possibility of another Supreme Court justice, quote, retiring. And the reporter's asking, well, who is that? Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Well, they said, why do you say that? He said, well, she only weighs 60 pounds. I mean, that's not Trump 101. I mean, she goes to the gym every day. I would not like to fight her, I'll tell you that. Plus, she'll probably be dead 2 years before the Democrats acknowledge that she's dead, as long as Trump is in office, to be very blunt with you, okay? To get some humor into this. So, but he's checking off. He's checking off those big issues. And I don't see the fervent Trump supporters saying he's at least changing some things. The economy, we're going to have 3% GDP this year. Wow. Sustained. The tax cuts. Not one Democrat voted for that tax cut. Could come back to haunt him. Now, when Reagan was president, there's been 2 tax cuts in my career that made a difference. President Kennedy, a Democrat, in the early 60s, And Ronald Reagan, he had 2, but his biggest one was 86. But Reagan's, his first election after tax reform, the Republicans did not do very well at the polls, but they backloaded the benefits of his tax cuts. This time, they're front loading. Increasingly, you're seeing the news, where beginning February, 70, 80, depending on what analysis you read, up to 90% of Americans are going to see increased in their paycheck. You're seeing companies today announce wage increases. Usually companies don't like to announce wage increases. Now it's good political PR for Trump. You know, you get one good Twitter feed out of Trump. It's because called PR, okay? Bonuses, etc. No one can convince me that this tax reform bill is not good for not only the American consumer, but the American public in general. When you drop your corporate rate from 35% down to 21%, yeah, not all companies were in that corporate tax rate. It's still a plus. And then you get doubling the standard deductions, etc. You're seeing it in the marketplace right now. My 401k, it's now a 601k, to tell you the truth. I look at it every day. You know, that's the signs of it nearing a top, by the way. I'm enamored with those results. But history shows that a tax cut of that size, it's not the biggest ever, as Trump says, hyperbole, it usually gives you 1 or 2 more years updraft in the stock market. 1 to 2 years. Now, from January 1 to now, to me, we're in an accelerating phase of the stock market. That's where you see your biggest gains. That's why you don't get out. But most people are nervous right now, especially people my age, who are saying, you know, I like to let her rip, but I don't want to see those gains evaporate. Poof. What with the wild cards that I've already talked about. So the economy is not only good, it could be very good. We're going to test that in November elections if it holds. So it's just going to be an interesting November. I've already talked about Russia. Here's the tax reform. For estate tax, some of the ag groups who mistakenly, I think, wanted a repeal of the estate tax didn't get the repeal. It would have cost $270 billion. That's a chunk of change even in Washington. But they got a doubling of the exemption, to $11 million individual, $22 million husband and wife. So it's going to affect very few. I'll guarantee you, the Democrats come back into power and have the clout to change it. They'll change it not back to where it was, but close to. Just that's their credo, you know. I had actually it was a meat producer in an audience before they did the changes, and he asked me, you know, we have an $8 million estate. Now that was before the 11 and 22 million. And he was talking about the problems of maybe in his estate. And I just said diplomatically, you can translate it by saying, you give me that $8 million estate and I won't complain. You know? Think of what the average American outside agriculture thinks about when they hear the U.S. ag sector wanting a total repeal in some of these numbers. Yes, it's double taxation, but that's not the issue. There's a junction level at which you make so much that theory says that you should give more back. You know, I'm in Medicare now, so now I'm going to defend Medicare. And I have to pay more because I'm one of these higher paid people. And I complained to my sister because she pays the minimum. She goes, you make more, you pay more. I said, all right, sis. She's wise. So I do it willingly. Because in Medicare, clear example, this eye was under Informa, who I took a buyout in May. That's why I wanted tax reform last year, by the way. I didn't get it. And this eye is on Medicare. I don't have to read any books about Medicare. This eye, Medicare, cost $800 less, okay, than this eye. Same result, same doctor. And also the eye drops, if you've had cataracts and all that. 3 different drops cost $60 a bottle, about like this level. And this one, Medicare, $10 a piece. It's just unbelievable what's going on in our healthcare system. Yeah, I help write the ag letter, the old Kiplinger ag letter, and we ask them the biggest issues, and I'm advancing some of my topics now. Number one was the current pricing situation in agriculture, financing. That was all grouped together. Not so much in the meat sector. I think in the hog sector, you're hitting probably doubles if you're a producer right now. Better than singles. Maybe triples are going to come once we stabilize that, trade policy. But in the grain sector, it's downturn. We're in a 4 to 7 year downturn that started in 2013. So, when's the low going to come? Tell me what we're going to do in trade policy. This could be the year that you establish at least the lows. We're going to see. But if Trump were to withdraw from NAFTA, you would have an ag recession. Just no question in my mind. It would be ugly. You would have exaggerated lows in the grain markets. Your tariffs in Mexico would go minimum up to 20%. There was a study out yesterday that said it would lead to 1.8 million fewer jobs in the United States initially. It would decrease the purchasing power of most Americans by around $650. Now, Trump's starting to listen when Pat Roberts, Senate Ag Committee Chairman, tells him in meetings, Mr. President, if you want to see the stock market go down the other way, and if you want to see you water down the positive benefits of your tax cuts, you walk away from NAFTA, and that's going to happen. He listens to arguments like that. And this is what the Aggies are beginning to do quite forcefully. But in the other tax reform, we have 100%, at least 5 years, equipment depreciation that we call the John Deere Amendment. But unlike other years, this also includes used equipment. And there are a lot of used equipment out there. So watch that one. I will tell you another thing. We had an item in Pro Farmer last week issue, a potential mega change that we see in the decade ahead. You need money to buy irrigation equipment, but it's coming more increasingly to the eastern Corn Belt states, Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin, etc. Reason? If you don't get rain at the right time when you really need it in corn, and if you have an irrigation unit, stats, facts, show it can make a difference of 100 bushels an acre corn. That'll pay for irrigation equipment. So depending on the state regs and the use of water, things like that, watch that. It may take a decade to have it go through, but that means you're going to have a more stable supply. And as far as the crop situation, etc., if you listen to AgriTalk, it's a fun type program. I'm on Tuesdays and Fridays. And all during the growing season last year, I kept on hearing the analysts that came on the program, well, this corn crop was better than expected. Well, what was expected? These smart analysts were not factoring in two things in my judgment. The ability, the final progress of all these years of stacked traits, 7 or 8 years, they're making a difference, coupled with seed management that we're seeing on the farm that equals higher yields. So it's going to have to take a big wallop from Mother Nature to really dig into that corn crop in the future. That doesn't mean it'll never happen. More so for soybeans. But right now, we have 2.5 billion bushels around of carryover for corn, almost 1 billion bushels of wheat, and almost 500 million bushels for soybeans. That's not a bull market for those commodities. And it means how you're going to get rid of the stuff. And that's where I like to connect dots. Well, you got to export it. And that brings trade policy. And this is why farmers, producers, and agribusiness people are not only anxious about Trump's trade policy, they're now getting angry about this. Because for many of them, that's not why they voted for him. That they could see a really detrimental impact in the marketplace. Other things, you can continue to write off interest expenses, and the other one I'm going to talk about, I could do a whole seminar on tax reform, but on this one is what they wanted to do in the 199 replacement for agricultural co-ops. Right before, the weekend before the tax reform went through, I was out in Fargo, North Dakota, to a MNDAC sugar beet annual meeting. And let me tell you, when you go to Fargo in December, if it does anything, it builds character, okay? And yes, they had a blizzard the day before, okay? And they come up to you and really thank you for visiting their state, okay? Now, they were forlorn that they were going to lose. At that time, 199 was totally out. And that, to make a long story short, it helps them give patronage payments. That's the lifeblood to many of the co-ops. So I told them, I said, never give up on a bill. Remember, I said this on your issues too, until it's actually enrolled. And they got a hold of Hovind from North Dakota, Republican, and Republican from South Dakota, John Thune, and they got language changes, and it's called 199A. Now, I don't think they vetted it that much, because it didn't take long. Can you imagine these big grain companies? I won't mention the names. It's kind of like Goliath didn't know everything after all. And it came out to be an unintended consequences that if you market grain or other products through a co-op, it was far more advantageous than through an independent elevator. Now, that's not good policy. But I'll tell you, again, I just came from the top producer meeting that more than a few farmers told me, don't change it. They penciled it out, which makes a big difference on the per bushel. It probably will be changed. But you think any Democrats are going to want to allow them easy change? No. So it'll be later rather than sooner, and it will probably be tied into either a budget resolution for next fiscal year or into this omnibus budget bill that I keep mentioning. That's the last train in town. Okay? So watch that one. Unintended consequences, yes.
Do you think that there will be some remnant of that left when it's all said and done?
Good question. What's going to happen? Yeah, I don't think you throw the baby out with the bathwater, because the ag co-ops still, they should probably try to clone what they had before. Okay? That's too simple for Congress to do. Okay? But I've been told they only have to change one or two words. I don't know whether that's true or not. Usually the other question I get is, will this be retroactive to January 1? Or if I sell to a co-op now, do I get, and you'll hear all sorts of estimates, but the best people I know, Paul Neiffer, his blog is farmcpatoday.com. It's actually written in English by a tax expert. Can you believe that? Farmcpatoday.com. He says for corn, it makes a difference of, depending on your tax bracket. If you're at the highest tax bracket, not many farmers are, it's 17% gain. Yeah, I'm sorry, 17 cents a bushel. And for the most farmers, it would make a difference of 10 to 12 cents. Now, independent elevators could probably match that or beat it, okay? But there are aspects of that language that are really advantageous to some producers that would not have to pay any taxes. So between net and gross and the language. So they shouldn't. There will be a price to pay at the election booth if they do away with the ag co-op benefits. So it's a fine line of how you change it. But that's all unintended consequences when you rush things. And I remember, again, as a fledgling reporter, the first thing my boss told me is when you issue a correction to a story, make sure the correction does not include errors. Okay? So they're going to hopefully make sure by talking to private tax analysts. Paul Neiffer called me the very next day after the language was out, and he said, Jim, I think we got a problem here. One day later. So who did they talk with? It's very interesting. But anyway, watch that provision. It's very important. 199A. Just Google it. You'll get anything you want. Agenda after tax reform. The next battles. Budget and spending limits. Both political parties like to spend a lot of money. So they'll eventually work up an agreement in which they can spend more for both defense on the Republican side and more for discretionary programs on the Democratic side. And will we get into the debt limit? To me, don't worry about. I mean, you have to with our debt limit. We've got $20 trillion debt, But even the Republicans aren't worried about it right now. It's just been interesting. Yes.
Does that
It will. Will that ever come up as a concern to Americans? If they keep going.
You look at our kids and our grandkids.
Agree.
We're just
I agree. Here's the facts. Right now, at the interest rates that we now have that are relatively low, it costs $260 billion just to service our current debt. If we were to go back to interest rates prevailing before the Great Recession, okay, that jumps to $650 billion a year just to service the debt. You tell me if you're going to get your vaccine money for foot and mouth disease under that environment. No. So yes, it will, but I don't know when that's going to be. Because people say, oh, Jim, you and others have talked about the woes of the debt. It just doesn't happen. That's called false assumptions. Okay? Yes, eventually it will. And that's why the Fed has kept interest rates as low as possible. They don't want the plus. They were worried about deflation, not inflation, to tell you the honest truth. But this thing could be, you watch the bond market. If the bond market thinks that Washington has lost control, the bond traders are the only editors Washington has. There would be substantial pain if we don't eventually come to grips with that. But I have no idea when that will be. Now, immigration. Your industry needs people, immigrants. And not only is it hard to find people, now it's just as hard to keep people because of the opioid crisis. Now we're having things stack up on you. So what I've seen the last now 3 years, I've written about this, we're at the beginning phase of the next industrial revolution in America and definitely in agriculture. What does agribusiness do when Washington doesn't have adequate policy for labor, for getting people? They look at technology. And this is not pie in the sky stuff. I've seen it. The dairy industry. I've seen 2 over the last few years, 24/7 ag-robotic dairies. Yeah, it takes 6 to 7 years to pay them off. But safety, they can go on vacation. They can run it from their iPhone, etc. Yeah, you have to look at the data and have right analysts, but they work. And when I go out west, Arizona, California, etc., just a few years ago, people with these big horticultural fields told me they were leaving 10 to 12% of their fields. They couldn't harvest them, not enough workers. So now you see with the age of robots, agbots we call them, they're getting better and better in sensitivity of when to pick a crop, how to pick it, etc. Almost every few months, the equipment gets better and better. You're seeing that. The grape arbors in California, absent the fires, they're using robots. A few weeks ago, I was at a show, and there was a drone firm who was waiting on regulatory okay to the drone can handle several hundred pounds of material, and how that will eventually change the aerial application industry. Think about that. And it's going to be safer, less drift, and things like that. This is just starting. Your industry, there's a lot of naysayers. Oh, you'll never be able to cut meat with the robot, marbling and all that other stuff. Bull. You give the agribusiness sector potential money growth, and think about the less insurance cost with no fingers cut. Okay? It's not a question of if, it's when. Now, it's going to take a while. So that's why immigration reform will happen. I'm one of the few minority, who thinks that, at least with Trump in there, you heard him before he blew up later with a supposed ugly term for certain countries. He opened the White House meeting and showed that he can converse on a topic. And he told his Republican Party, don't worry, I'll take the heat. I'll take the heat in compromising on this. In return, maybe 10 to 12 years process to get citizenship for the DACA children. And even President Obama admits that he didn't have constitutional grounds to have the DACA, which means deferred action for childhood arrivals. Deferred action means something. It means this is not permanent. Yes, we need immigration reform. I give a lot of talks to the sugar beet and sugarcane industry. And I've seen over the last few years, they call them RVers. They go from the Washington State all across the northern tier in these beautiful, huge RVs, like custom harvesters. And in their off time, when they're not working in sugar beet fields, they go and clean up national parks, or they work for Amazon distribution centers. Do you read about this elsewhere? No. People like to say negative stories all the time. But this is what our industry is doing, and I'm thankful that we have thinkers in our industry. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a people problem. We do. The numbers. So how can you keep exporting product when you're having a hard time having the people to do the work on it? Now, biodiesel tax incentive impacts the price of soybean meal, which is an ingredient for the feed industry in the pork complex. I think it's going to be extended as part of this omnibus budget bill. You see how that's adding up? It's going to have things more in it than the front line of the Philadelphia Eagles. Going to be loaded. They'll retroactively extend that, and maybe extend it another 1 to 2 years, maybe phase down, if not phase out. Cotton and dairy program, I don't want to get too wonky on you, but we could have substantial changes in the cotton and dairy program before the writing of the new farm bill as part of this omnibus budget bill. That will make the farm bill writing easier, but not easy, because it gives them a budget baseline. Infrastructure reform. We had another delay in the Trump administration's issuing of their infrastructure reform. Now they're saying sometime in February. A couple days ago, someone leaked a 6-page document on details of some of the infrastructure reform. Now the White House is beginning to back away from it, but I don't believe it. I think a lot of that is the outline of the infrastructure reform proposals. But it didn't have anything regarding how to fund infrastructure reform, and that's your biggest ingredient. Wherever major legislation you go to, how are you going to pay for it? Now, this is where the Democrats, I think, have it over the Republicans relative to how to fund it. Not through taxes. You won't have increases in gasoline taxes going into the November elections. But it's public-private partnerships. Well, I don't understand why Republicans don't like them, because they work, at least in the East Coast, they do. I have they call it the Greenway, that we pay. I mean, I pay $250 a month just to use the Greenway. Believe it or not, yeah. But it works. It works, and it's fast. And Americans will pay for speed, okay? But watch that. Agriculture needs infrastructure reform. Our great inland waterway system, our port systems, our railroads, our highway systems, etc. I don't think I have to tell the pork industry the benefits of an adequate transportation system, both for domestic markets and also for the throughput market in the trade, as you increasingly count on increases in pork exports. So you see the connecting dots here. Trade policy, transportation policy, macro policy, fiscal policy. These are all important. And this is all my city slicker friends who ask me what I talk about to ag groups. And I tell them these topics. They go, you mean agriculture has to worry about all that? Yeah. You have to be pretty smart in our industry, right? Having to go through all this stuff, okay? Farm bill should be one of the easier bills, but I'll go through that later. That's the Supreme Court. I've already talked about that. Elections, there's your 26 Democratic senators are up for re-election. 10 in states Trump carried, okay? And 5 in which he won by 19 points or more. But if you have the wrong candidate, as we saw in Alabama, or if this women movement, continues to develop, that's going to be a hard hurdle for the Republicans primarily, okay? Only 8 Republican seats. Will the GOP expand their current 51 to 49 majority, quote majority? Yeah, I think so, 1 to 2 seats. We could even be 50-50, and the vice president breaks ties, okay? Unless, again, they pick the wrong candidates. And let me go through, you heard in the government shutdown, where Schumer and other Democrats said, and you know, Nancy Pelosi, and don't get me going on her, but when they said, well, the Republicans control the White House, they control, keyword there is control the House, and they control the Senate. So it's up to them. No. Maybe in the House, in the White House, but the Senate, you need 60 votes. So just do the math. There's 51 Republicans. If everyone voted for that bill to invoke cloture, stop debate, to allow the government not to shut down, you needed at least 9 Democrats. So they don't have the control. The only reason President Obama got Obamacare through was in his first 2 years, they had over 60 Democrats. So don't, and I know most Americans probably see through this. These people think Americans are stupid, you know? Do the math. They don't control. As I said, it could change in the very next election, and that's what you're seeing. House is in play. Democrats need a net gain of 24 seats. On average, the change in the first off-year election of a president in the White House is 32 seats. On average, you know? But Earl Butz was the first ag secretary I covered many years ago in the Nixon administration. And he always used to tell the joke that he went out with 2 economists duck hunting, and they saw a duck. The first economist shot, he was about 10 feet too soon. The second economist shot, he was about 10 feet too late. And they turned to Earl, and he goes, you know, on average, that damn duck is dead. Okay? That tells you averages. Watch those averages, okay? You're an average student. Compared to who? Compared to who, okay? Now, let's dig a little deeper. These are the Senate races where it's going to be won or lost. The blue are Democrats. The red are Republicans. Donnelly in Indiana, Democrat. McCaskill, Missouri. I was just in Missouri last week for 3 speeches. And then their governor, by the way, in Missouri could actually work in Washington with his troubles, by the way. Manchin from West Virginia. Smith from Minnesota, who took the place of Al Franken. And then the Republicans, Jeff Flake, that Trump calls flaky, in Arizona, an open seat now, and Arizona is beginning to turn more Democratic, turning, a gerund, I-N-G. Heller from Nevada is a Republican, probably a pickup in the case of the Democrats, and an open seat Corker in Tennessee. So it's going to be won or lost. You just follow those states, okay? Now, what party will gain seats in the Senate next fall? Subject to change, because it's still early. I would say it's either going to be 50-50 or the Republicans will gain 1 to 2 seats. By no means control. What party will gain seats in the House? Easy. Democrats, how many? And then it gets iffy. The person I like the best on House seats is a friend of mine, Dave Wasserman, Cook Political Report. They had a lot of free information on the internet, and it's good perspective. And Dave Wasserman says it's going to come down, 435 races are going to come down to about 10 seats. So, and he thinks either political party could win the House by 1 to 2 seats. So it's going to be squeezy tight. Yeah.
Your contention is that with the dynamics that are going on, the retirement or the lack of some of the chairs succeeding or being there, you're going to see some change even with the Republicans in control.
Yes, because if you have open seats, it's fair game. It's fair game. Absolutely. Now, Dave says the Senate is more Republican-type issues, the races. The House is more regionals, and you have a lot of urban districts that clearly favor the Democrats. So he's predicting the Democrats take over the House. Yeah. And he is one of the best experts on House races, a young whippersnapper. If you ever have him, I know MPPC in Washington has had, I don't think they've had Dave, but they've had Charlie Cook, who's his boss. But Dave, if he was in an audience where every state was represented in every district, he knows the existing representative and the opponent. He's unbelievable to hearing. Plus, he knows how to speak English. So I love people like that. Yeah, who just don't, wow, what did he just say? Translation, you know. He's a good guy. Will Trump run for re-election? Listen how I answer this one very carefully. Yes, if he can. Okay? I'll let you define that. And will he win? Depends who the Democratic candidate is. Now, the Democrats are going to be much like the Republicans were in the last presidential election, Big Tent. Think through it. Will Oprah run? I think she's too smart to run, by the way, but we'll see. You'll have Bernie Sanders, of course. Once you run for office, you always want to run again. Okay? We'll see if the younger people, who by that time in college will have hopefully passed college and got a job and looked at their check. I always tell millennials this. I want to be there when you get your first paycheck and see you gasp at all the taxes taken out, right? Then will you vote for Bernie? He wants to give you free school, free health care. Like, it's an algebraic equation where nobody pays for that, okay? They'll change. Then you'll have maybe Elizabeth Warren. Wow. She's one sharp cookie, but she's out there, far left, okay? And, Gillibrand, Kirsten from New York. There's a whole gambit. Will Joe Biden run? That could be interesting. If Joe Biden wins, then they would bring the Obama delegation in. You don't know, so we'll see. You see how I can weasel out of answers on that, By just saying you just don't know. That's why you have to keep listening. There's your 34 states in which the governor who will be in office for the next redistricting will be elected this year. And that's why they're important. We'll make this available, this presentation to you, so you can call it up and study it when you have more time. Trade policy, we're there. I want to keep on time. His third day in office, President Trump withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was a mistake. It really was. It took 7 years to get through that agreement, and for agriculture, it had net pluses. In the sanitary and phytosanitary area for enforcement and things like that, more market access. We even got Canada to open up their dairy market a little bit. But Trump, in theory, does not like multilateral trade agreements, more than one country. He thinks he can do a better job in negotiating with one-on-one. He's probably right there in theory. But not when an agreement was already done. So early in March, the TPP 11, there used to be 12, including the U.S., we backed off, they're going to sign this agreement. And this is what have the agriculture stakeholders so upset. This agreement's going to have better terms than you have right now with those countries. And other countries, Europe, Japan, China, Australia, going around the world inking trade agreements. And frequently, they are better market access terms than the U.S. has right now. So we're being left behind. That's not a good development. So we need to turn our trade policy around. I've talked about enough about NAFTA. I'll have some charts later on. The chorus, what we call the Korea-U.S. trade agreement, I think they're just going to tweak it. Trump errantly says that brings up the trade deficit with countries. Again, if you're a student of history, a developed country of our duration and size typically always has a deficit in trade. That doesn't mean it's a negative. It just means your countries are a country of consumers and getting products either we don't produce and are cheaper for whatever reason. Okay? In the case of South Korea and a number of other countries, our growing might in the energy technology area, fracking, batteries, fusion cells, are going to increasingly narrow the spread of that trade deficit. If we're really smart, we'll open up those exports. Liquefied natural gas. You could cut the trade deficit within a few years to South Korea. They need energy. And you think they want to rely on the Mideast in an increasingly fractious world in which the U.S. appears to be withdrawing overall support the way we used to. So all this is going on. Big time, heady stuff. Of course, one of the things that I think Obama did right was the Cuba But now Trump is redrawing back, drawing back all the market openings that Obama did in Cuba. And I think Obama was right because we tried the embargo for 50 years. It just didn't work. And Canada and Europe left all the way to the bank. And Cuba will eventually have money. It's called energy off their shores. They just need money to develop it. And plus, again, as a student of history, it's harsh, but it's true. We invaded Cuba in '59. They didn't invade us, to be very blunt. So, now, I can go through the impacts of NAFTA, but you know what they are. It'd be at least 20% increase in tariffs on your products. Mexico's a big ham importer. Poof, their cost goes up at least 20%. So we have a current round going on in Montreal this week until Monday. Canada is starting to announce some innovative ideas on the biggest issue in NAFTA is not agriculture. It's the auto trade area. So here's another secret of Trump, if you read the book. You don't have to change NAFTA all that much, but give him some new aspects that have never been in NAFTA, digital trading, other aspects, where he can eventually say, it's the greatest agreement ever. That's Trump. He can say that he meant something. But now he's saying it's the worst trade agreement ever, an insult to agriculture. Because the facts are there that it's been far better than worse. Not for all commodities, but definitely for the meat sector, which stands the most to lose if he walks away. Now Trump is saying, they were saying this week's talk in Montreal, make or break. Usually any make or break meeting is not a make or break meeting, okay? Trump said a few weeks ago, Mexico has elections July 1. Maybe we'll go past that because they may not be as willing to negotiate until after their election. Well, then that signals that maybe we might not be able to negotiate until after our November elections. Bottom line, you will probably have a NAFTA 2.0 conclusion. We won't walk away, but it could be near the end of the year, this year, before we see the end zone on that. Then it's up to Congress to pass the thing. And if Trump even were to withdraw, there was the Senate leadership had a colleague meeting Tuesday, and they're starting to search what avenues they have as a treaty, as a North American treaty, to take on Trump if he were to withdraw. So I would watch that development. Here's the chart that won Trump over, that Sonny Perdue gave Trump by telling him don't leave NAFTA, because these are the states that have the most trade with Canada and Mexico: Texas, Ohio, Louisiana, Indiana, and Wisconsin. All those states that Trump needed to win the election. So, don't give Trump 3 or 4 or 5 pages of copy. No. He's a lot like Reagan in that regard. He likes colorful charts, okay, that tell a story. That's what he understands. He's a businessman. Now, and look at percent of ag exports dependent on NAFTA. Now, this is from, American Farm Bureau. Now, most commodity groups, I think, overstate the pluses of, trade agreements, but the direction is right. But their data indicates 73% of all ag exports in North Dakota go to either Canada or Mexico. You think they don't agree that NAFTA is good? Look at the other percentages: 70% in Missouri, over 60% in Michigan, Wisconsin a little over 50%, 41% in Indiana. This is big time stuff here. It would hurt the overall U.S. economy if we were to withdraw. All the interrelationships that we built up in the shipping area, supply area, automobile area, etc. It's big, big, big. It would cause a big squeeze to some sectors, agriculture in some states, as I've already gone through. It could impact the stock markets, and as I said before, it's beginning to turn around Trump in the arguments. The food, auto, and apparel makers that are very efficient right now in crafting the North American market would stand the most to lose. So it's obvious to me. Next Farm Bill. This will be the first time since '96 that an all-Republican Congress could pass a bill. That means the Republicans, again, control in quotes, House and the Senate. But it's the first time since 1954 when all the White House, House, and Senate passed a farm bill. That's interesting. Can they do it? Politics, we'll see. When will we get a new farm bill signed into law? These are the questions I'm asked. See, you get the best because I've given a potpourri of topics, and these are some of the questions I'm asked. I go, you know, the majority of people in Washington think it's going to be 2019. That's why you notice I don't say 2018 farm bill. I've learned my lesson on farm bills. It was supposed to be the 2012 or 2011 farm bill. It wound up being the 2014 farm bill. I'm not stupid, you know. It depends on the Democrats in the Senate. Do they want an issue or do they want a bill? You see? So there's only one person you got to watch, Debbie Stabenow, Democrat, Michigan, ranking member on the Senate Ag Committee. Now, she's working pretty good right now with Pat Roberts, who's the committee chairman from Kansas. So if she works along with them, they could get a bill yet this year. I think the House Ag Committee will mark up their bill in the first March, early March, and that they should have a bill out of the on the floor at the end of March if the Republican leadership gives them the okay. But that means we have to have a budget. There's that budget coming back. The omnibus budget has to be approved before you start action on the Farm Bill. They need to know the bottom line stuff. So this is why one has to come before the other. The Senate's going several months later. They'll probably introduce their bill sometime mid to late spring, work on it in the summer. Then you have to have a House-Senate conference. Whether or not they can do that prior to the long August recess remains to be seen. That's why some people say you're too close to the election. They'll just wait. You could have it in a lame duck session after the elections, and especially if the Republicans lose either chamber. Okay? Then, of course, in the House side, it depends on food stamps. House Ag Committee Chairman Mike Conaway, Republican from Texas, is walking a fine line. The White House and other conservatives in the party wants to reform, food stamps. Well, if they reform it too much, then Colin Peterson, who's the ranking person on the House Ag Committee, and he'll be told by the Democratic leadership, don't support the Farm Bill. So watch the food stamp issue in the House. I've talked about cotton and dairy. Those programs need repaired, fixed. What will the commodity title look like? There's not enough money to really do substantial changes. Won't be revolutionary. It'll be evolutionary. Biggest blocks to approval of a new farm bill, as I said before, politics. And then you always watch food stamps. Do the Democrats want a farm bill or an issue? Does crop insurance get by without cuts? I think. But there'll be a series of amendments put through to really attack one of the few farm programs that actually work. The crop insurance definitely does. What will be USDA-Purdue's role in the Farm Bill? You saw it earlier this week when they announced a series of principles, general themes of a Farm Bill. They won't have much impact. They implement the Farm Bill. They do not write it, meaning the administration. Let's go down to, I've already talked about crop insurance. Conservation Reserve Program. It currently has a maximum acres of 24 million acres. Colin Peterson wants to increase that to 32 million acres. He's probably going to get it. He'll pay for it by lower county rental rates, about 85% of existing county rental rates. Those are your grain programs. The ARC and the PLC, they're going to be tweaked not much. Cotton's going to get an effective safety net. Dairy is going to be interesting as a livestock market, so to speak. Here's what you're looking for in dairy policy, because I think that they could be getting at least the chance to get the most fundamental change in dairy policy in my 42 years in Washington. If they repeal the $20 million cap under a program called LGM, Livestock Gross Margin Program, that will be the most effective insurance program that I've seen in dairy since I've been in town. Hell, I may even want to produce dairy. It'll be a safety valve. So watch that one. It will be a mega change for the dairy industry. Now for you, usually your sector, beef and pork, you usually say, well, keep us out of this stuff. We don't, just let us alone. But this time, you want a vaccine bank for hopefully never that we get foot and mouth disease. Now, you're asking for $150 million a year because you have to produce just not one vaccine, but several vaccines to ward that off. But you're going to get money, but not anywhere near $150 million a year. But your industries are very visionary that you're thinking ahead. You're thinking ahead to what could be a wild card that could devastate your industry. And this is not just a meat industry issue. I tell the corn and soybean people, if you think this thing wouldn't affect you, just look what's happened in mad cow disease when that occurred, you know? So watch that one. What inroads has Trump administration made in rolling back regulations? Big time. That's one of his signature issues, cost benefits. What will become of Obamacare? If 2019, if those premiums continue to go up, both Democrats and Republicans will have to increase the subsidies. I don't think it's going away. One of those issues that farmers told us relative to the agriculture letter, number 2, was healthcare cost. Interesting. In the farm, if you don't have a spouse working off the farm, you have to pay. And costs have gone up 160% over the last 3 years. I've talked to many farmers who are paying $12,000 for policy and 7, 8, 9, 10 double-digit, deductibles. I mean, can you imagine? That's big-time stuff. Our healthcare system needs reform. Immigration, I've talked about reform. What's your prediction on commodity prices? Whenever a policy outlook, person starts talking outlook, it's look out, okay? In the grains, I see range-bound markets until we know better what the number of acres are. Relative to the U.S., you won't have much change between the corn and soybean acres. But now we're looking at Argentina and South America, and you've seen the bump up in soybean prices the last few days because of Argentina continues hot and dry. The wheat market, we have a growing drought building from the deep south into the plains area, and if it moves into the Midwest, then you're talking some impacts, but that's if-come type stuff. In the soybean complex, you would need a 5% cut in the soybean crop next year to have any significant sustained price punch. By the way, 5% equals 200 million bushels. When I asked the poll of traders that I've used over the years, and they're still trading, so they must be doing something right, it's the equivalent of 200 million bushels of soybeans. When I asked them what percent odds do they give that, they said 20%. So, not likely. I've told you about the top issues for farmers and agribusiness people are talking about. The pricing, financing situation is starting to get ugly out in the financing area where an increasing number of farmers are getting their financing not from banks but from input companies. But it's not near like it was in the 1980s when we had a literal depression in agriculture. We're not anywhere near that right now. And so hopefully we'll base here in the grains this year and then start to trek up. You have to base before you go higher. I've said healthcare cost was a big one. Trade policy was number 3, and we've discussed that. 4 was labor. Wherever you go now, it's the labor issues. We've discussed that. And the 5th one was, and I dealt with the technology, both pros and cons, the fear of the technology, how much it's going to cost, where's this thing going to end. If you don't stay ahead, you're going to be left behind. That's probably the case. Last chart. The wild cards. Will the Fed become too aggressive? I will tell you what to watch out for the Fed. They're going to increase interest rates. Same thing like they did last year in March, June, and December. Now, and they'll increase them 25 basis points. If they were to do a September increase, which is too close to the election, they don't usually do that. Oh, that's interesting. That means they might see something, a better economy, more inflation than what their prior forecast saw. Or if that 25 basis points become a 50 basis points, that they want to start going a little faster. So use that as a barometer. That's the best I can tell you on the Fed. And that would move the dollar, by the way. If any one of those, that would make the dollar go higher. Geopolitics, I've already said. North Korea. Political shocks, Trump and Russia. What's going to happen there? Bursting bubbles. Bitcoin, I don't think it's a major factor, except it made my person who owns my lawn service rich. I mean, I called the best economist I knew, and I think he was right saying stay out of it, but what do? You know, my lawn person's retiring. he caught a wave, caught a wave. Okay, that's my formal presentation. We have a few minutes, maybe up to 10 minutes to ask any questions or comments. My email is my last name at gmail.com, Wiesemeyer@gmail.com. I always say I know when I'm right, but I don't know when I'm wrong, and you have an uncanny ability to tell me. So fire away at me. Any questions on topics I did not address, or you want more information on topics that I did, on anything? Yes?
Those Senate candidates on the Democratic side, you had most of them as relatively safe. Are some of those that you have listed as relatively safe in states that Trump won and maybe won by a significant margin?
Yeah, most of them are fairly safe Democratic states. Yeah. Well, like Missouri. Missouri is one where McCaskill should lose. She should have lost the last time. But remember, that's when whoever it was said the thing about rape, you know, and then she got in. So I think she's a goner myself. Okay? Donnelly, usually Indiana's a Republican state. But Donnelly, in my farmer meetings that I go to, Indiana Farm Bureau, corn and soybean growers, he's made his mark in the rural sector. So I think it's going to be harder to get out of the office. I forget the other states. I'm sorry? North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp talks the talk, walks the walk. And when that guy pulled out, that could have taken her on, but I still would have predicted that she would have. And Trump won that by over 20 points. But that's where your local candidate, if they truly reflect the state, and she does. She's really a good candidate. She knows what she's talking about. Plus, her brother owns a radio station, so she's got a mouthpiece there. But she's pretty effective. She knows. She's a very, very intelligent woman. Yeah. So when you add these up, you say, well, how are the Republicans going to gain one or two? I may have to reassess, okay? But they have some other waves that they could do in some of those states that Trump won. And I'd have to go through each state. Yes?
And then on the House side, you often hear how the Republicans did such a good job of redistricting, after the last census, that they can't lose the House anymore. Is that totally bogus?
No, that's not bogus. Usually, there's very few competitive seats. Very few. But as I said, and now to where with the anti-Trump fervor, off-year elections mean a lot on whether or not you're motivated to go to the polls. So it appears, based on some polls right now, that more Democrats will be motivated to go to the polls. And then if you add in at least that's the theory, okay, that experts say. Again, the same ones that were wrong and not forecasting Trump. But you add in the layer where the women's movement, by all means not all Democrats, but fueled in large part, a growing number of women candidates, a record amount. It's going to make it harder, and you're bucking history. It's just, even though the economy's going to be good, we'll see if that's a tempering offset. And I want to see Trump's approval ratings about a month before the elections. If he were to get to 45 to 50%, then the Republicans could retain the House. So watch those. That's one Gallup poll that I respect, because that's got a pretty good history of tracking on that one. Yeah. But you're right in that there's very few, because both political parties have what we call gerrymandered their districts. That really the biggest concern that representatives have, whether they're Democrat or Republicans, is being primaried by a person in their own party, not from the opposing party. But it's this off-year election where it's a referendum on Trump. It's whether or not, what's the economy at the time, what action did he take, if any, on the trade policy? Because that could have election implications to a number of House races. And as what I told you, what Dave Wasserman said, the House districts, you look at the regionality, cities. I mean, you can almost look at the dot map that you see after every presidential election, and you know where the cities are, you know where the blacks are populated, which is true, and you know where the Hispanics are at, because that's and more often than not, that's where the Democrats are garnering the votes. Just, it's fact. Okay? Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about President Trump's relationship?
I'm sorry?
Can you talk a little bit about President Trump's relationship with the legislative leads on both sides?
Yeah, Trump's relationship with legislative leaders.
Oh, yeah. From
Democrat and Republican. Actually, I think he has more rapport with Chuck Schumer than almost any lawmaker. He said he grew up with Chuck Schumer, so there's the history there. I think he was a Democrat at some juncture in his life. I think some of his proclivities are that way, but as a businessman, that's the Republican side in him. He is a people person, but his sensitivities, even with people who have helped him, he can lash out. He can be unbelievably charitable for him one day, and if they vote against him or say something, I mean, prickly. He's very prickly. You've heard him. You've heard him. Just look at his own words, hurt him the most. So, very unusual candidate. But if you watch the program Big Bang Theory and Sheldon, where he always says his mother, he's not crazy because his mother had him tested, well, at least Trump can say that at least he's been tested, okay, in that regard. He's just the most unusual person I've ever seen at the head of the White House. As I said before, many people like some of the changes that he's done. It's just how he does it, and he could be getting more done. He could have been the person that did reach across the political aisle because he has the communication skills, that he could have been the right person at the right time. So we're going to have to wait for that. But he's not going to change. Just will not change. Just will not. So don't expect him to. So he has a love-hate relationship to almost any lawmaker on both political parties. Just, he's not a politician. Yeah. NAFTA? And like Canada. Okay, what he just said is of how Canada and Mexico, especially Canada, the feeling amongst many in the U.S., and I would say most, is that Canada hasn't come to the negotiating table and wanting to compromise, especially when it comes to their dairy program, which is the focus not only of President Trump's comments earlier this year and last year, but also Colin Peterson, the ranking member on the House Ag Committee. Because you're not going to get that bill through. Even if we got a NAFTA agreement, can it even pass Congress? So that's the whole next hurdle to cross. Not trying to defend Canada, but I would take from a negotiating perspective, why give up too early? You don't want to compromise too early. And even Trump's people, Wilbur Ross, got upset at the ag groups for taking on the administration and putting all the pluses of the existing NAFTA. It was primarily done because they think in their minds that if you criticize them, that hurts their negotiating strategy. That's really why that's going on. Canada, you will not change Canada's supply management program in the dairy sector. It's like our sugar program. It's got widespread support. Now, can you increase their market access for dairy products? Probably so. Some of the Trump people tell me if we can just get an opening in the dairy market in Canada that's a little bit above what we had in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, Trump will declare that a victory because he'll say, look, it's better than TPP. It's better than what you have now. So I don't think agriculture is other than dairy, is a big component of this thing. It's what you could lose if you didn't get an agreement, not what you can get out of any new agreement. But the big kahuna is the auto trade. And Canada is creatively, if I believe some of the stories coming out from there, they've got a creative twist on it that may give cover to all three countries, that they're changing the auto content enough that won't hurt the supply and distribution of not only automobiles, but the efficiencies that's been built up over the 24 years of the life of NAFTA. But we're just really starting in the NAFTA agreement because of usually the hardest things are waiting until the last 20% of the time. We don't even know the timeline under the NAFTA. First it was going to be March, remember? No. You're well into this year. But for the U.S. ag sector, I was on a program with your CEO of MPPC, Neil Dirks, AgriTalk Tuesday, and he talked about the coalitions that agriculture has built up with other businesses. And what a spokesman for agriculture. He listed through those percentages like they were a macro key. He had them down pat, you know. I don't think that's the issue. It's where the emotionality of Trump can get us through to the end zone. Because you saw it, remember when he talked in Nashville, Tennessee, to Farm Bureau on a Monday. And it was kind of what he didn't say. He didn't threaten to withdraw from NAFTA. 3 days later, in an interview with Wall Street Journal, he said, I don't really think we're going to have the NAFTA and we'll probably have to withdraw. So there's the good cop, bad cop of Trump in 3 days. So is it who he talks to the last, you know, that he spouts off? Or is this all a negotiating strategy? I think it's mainly huff and puff, because that's what he is. He's huff and puff. Now, his theory is pretty good. As a result, I had an executive tell me, he's told us, you think I don't know trade? You don't think we need business? So most of this is theater, but it's hard to go through. It's just hard to go through when you're talking to your constituents in your industry who's hanging with, what, 22, 23% of your product, or if not more, is exported. And then top heavy for Canada and Mexico. This is heady stuff. But you're just one microcosm of that issue. But yet we're the only major industry that has a surplus in trade. So agriculture is doing something right. So I think reason will eventually prevail. If not, then it's going to be ugly time in the ag sector market. He'll put in the lows, and they'll be ugly, exaggerated lows. You know, how long will it last? In fact, that'll dovetail into the Farm Bill. A big portion of the Farm Bill, if he were to withdraw from NAFTA, you watch change the tone of the Farm Bill debate. They'll have to come up with the safety net program to cushion the blow for the ag sector. Money. They'll actually get more money as a result of that. So I can't predict that. But they have contingency plans. Remember last year when Sonny Perdue, USDA, acknowledged that they had contingency plans, and boy, was he pulled back of that from the White House. See? So they're behind the scenes, they're thinking through that. So most of the same people, Cohen from the National Economic Council, Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, these are Goldman Sachs people. They know that you should have a continuation of NAFTA. And they don't buy the argument that Trump sometimes uses. Well, it's not that even if we withdraw, we'll work an agreement with Mexico and Canada. Well, that's not going to be so easy. Bilaterals. Japan does not want to have a bilateral with us because they want to see what goes on in NAFTA. They don't want to work an agreement and then Trump, after so many months or years, say, well, we're going to walk away from it. See, that's the signal that he's giving that makes all trade policy analysts just topsy-turvy right now. You don't know how to call trade policy right now. So it's Wild West. Wild West. So all that, there's no answers right now. I can just tell you opinions. You know, 42 years, I think I've learned a little bit, but I'm not right all the time. But I don't think they would be that stupid to walk away from an agreement that mostly works. Yeah, seasonal vegetables have problems, Florida, Arizona, et cetera. And that's what's tied up Greg Dowd, who's the chief ag negotiator nominee, because Jeff Flake's upset about one proposal in NAFTA. So he holds up the biggest ag negotiator who's worked for the Wheat Growers Association in his lifetime in the beef. So he knows the beef market, but he's not sitting at the negotiating table. Right at the time that you're in the bottom line, it just makes no sense. And these are Republicans holding up, you know? Bill Northey, your Iowa ag secretary, being held up from a key USDA spot by Ted Cruz, Republican from Texas, over renewable fuel standard policy. Why? Because he wants a major reform. They can't get it through the right way, legislation, so he wants to pound. Well, he's confronted Grassley. Grassley will win that battle every time. He's got a history of winning on RFS. Okay? I don't want to run them too late. 11:45, let's see. Yeah, I'm already late. I mean, not to the airport, to you. Again, you've been a good audience. You've had good questions. Email me if you have any personal questions or comments. I thank you very much.